Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Confronting Capitalism, How the World Works and How to Change It, by Vivek Chibber, narrated by Shawn K. Jain. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. Across the advanced capitalist world, something very significant has been unfolding over the past 5 years or so. The ideological legitimacy of the neoliberal model of capitalism has collapsed. After almost 4 decades of unchallenged hegemony, free market fundamentalism is under attack, not just among marginal left groupings, but in the political mainstream. Working people of all races and ages, who for years labored with the conviction that there is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher famously put it, have issued a very clear warning that they are fed up with the untrammeled rule of capital. That frustration is being expressed in many and sundry ways, most typically inchoate, sometimes ugly, and overwhelmingly through electoral revolts rather than organized class struggle. But it is so pervasive that it feels like we are in a new political era. Oddly, the political turn has been most sharply expressed in the unlikeliest of places, the United States. An early tremor could be felt in the Occupy movement in 2011, but the real catalyst was Bernie Sanders' historic runs for the Democratic Party's nomination for president in 2016 and 2020. Since his explosive entrance onto the national political stage, there has been an unmistakable revival of left anti-capitalist discourse at a scale not witnessed in 2 generations. And even while his presidential runs are likely over, the thrust toward a social democratic turn in American politics has not abated. Indeed, it has gathered steam. The largest left-wing organization in the United States today, the Democratic Socialists of America, is nearing 100,000 members, up from around less than 10,000 in 2015. There is an identifiable social democratic wing of the Democratic Party, still small by any reasonable standard, but its very existence is a significant step forward. Within the left, discussions are taking on issues of strategy and tactics, whereas just a few years ago they rarely rose above recondite debates around trivial philosophical hobby horses, and there is a small but unmistakable turn toward labor organizing. This book is intended to contribute to the development of the incipient left. One of the most glaring weaknesses of the current culture is the dearth of clear and simple introductions to the basic dynamics of capitalism. When the socialist movement was at its peak in the interwar years, intellectuals associated with communist parties, socialist organizations, and trade unions produced a rich corpus of pamphlets and short booklets intended to serve as pedagogical tools and organizing aids. This practice even carried over into the New Left, albeit less robustly. But by the 1980s, it was a dying art. This was no doubt because of the processes I briefly examine in chapters 3 and 4 of this book, chief among which was not just the defeat of the organized left, but more importantly, the complete takeover of radical discourse by the professional classes, academics, and nonprofits. Radical theory became less concerned with disseminating and popularizing its advances, and turned inward, toward the professional concerns of those producing it. It became ever more abstruse, apolitical, and ultimately pessimistic about the very possibility of political transformation. The retreat into the academy wasn't all bad. There were some genuine advances in Marxist and other socialist theories over what had been inherited from the classical left. But because the links to the working class had largely been severed, the new developments remained buried in specialized journals and scholarly monographs. One of the most pressing tasks now is not only to put theory back into the hands of organizers, but to ensure that it is as up-to-date as possible, and presented in a language that doesn't seem imported from 1870. I've also tried to keep to the essentials so as not to get ensnared in Talmudic debates around sacred texts, and have also steered clear of more arcane analytical debates. After more than 40 years of neoliberalism, the road back to sanity is going to be a long one, and it is by no means certain that we will achieve it. Even while free market fundamentalism is ideologically weakened, it is still a strong political force. For the latter to change, the left will have to gather up its strength at a scale we have not seen since mid-century. At present, even as the socialist left gains its ideological footing, it is in political disarray. It is my hope that this book, and other efforts like it, help advance the project of renewal. Chapter 1. The Basic Structure. Introduction. For most Americans in the years leading up to the COVID pandemic, daily life was like an obstacle course. When the Pew Charitable Trust, one of the nation's leading polling agencies, queried Americans on their sense of financial security in 2015, it found that 50% of those polled declared that they felt acutely insecure about their financial situation. An astounding 71% declared that they could not pay their bills, and 70% said that they did not have enough saved to retire. The feeling of insecurity about their future weighs so heavily on the minds of Americans that a whopping 92% said that they would give up economic mobility in exchange for economic security. It is not that the respondents don't wish for mobility. Rather, they view their situation as being so precarious that they would forego future economic gains for a sense of stability here and now. Things are not this bad for everyone. In fact, for those at the apex of American society, life has never been so good. For America's richest families, the last 40 years have been something like a non-stop party. Even as incomes have stagnated for the vast majority, the richest 10% have gotten richer and fatter. In the United States, around 86% of all the increase in personal wealth between 1983 and 2019 went to this group, while just over 5% went to the bottom 80% of the population. In fact, it gets worse as you go up. Within that top 10%, the bulk of the gains went to the infamous 1%ers, 41.6%, while the next 5% captured 1/3 of all gains in those years. The story is very much the same with income. The 1%ers took away 1/3 of all new income between 1983 and 2019, and the top 10% combined captured almost 70%. In other words, even as the economy has gotten better and more efficient since 1980, almost all the direct benefits have gone to those who were already rich. Any decent person would agree that there is something fundamentally wrong with the situation. How can it be that in a society with such enormous resources and wealth, a thin layer of the population at the top gets to have everything, while millions upon millions experience life as a daily grind, a struggle just to make ends meet? Well, mainstream media and talking heads do have an explanation, and it tends to be of two kinds. The first places the blame on individuals. It's exemplified in what Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain said in his 2012 primary campaign. If you don't have a job and you're not rich, blame yourself. What Cain meant is that the only thing standing between you and a decent life is your willingness to work hard. So if you are in poverty, stuck in a bad job, or simply unemployed, it is because you cannot or will not put in the effort to succeed. You either refuse to put in the hours, or you refuse to accept the wage and the hours that come with the job. You are either too lazy or too precious. But then, if this is so, of course you have no one to blame but yourself. The second explanation blames the government. The basic idea is that social problems arise because the government keeps interfering in the market, preventing it from functioning the way it is supposed to. If left to itself, the market is both fair and maximally efficient. As long as people want to work, everyone will find a job. If they have special skills, the market will recognize and reward them for it. If they have an idea that will make money, banks will give them the credit to start their own business and become rich. Markets spontaneously tend toward full employment, and they reward people for their talents. The problem is that governments won't leave them alone. Politicians and special interests pile on regulations that squelch entrepreneurial initiative. They launch welfare schemes that get people hooked on welfare. They don't let goods flow freely across borders, and so on. The solution, therefore, is to get the government out of the economy and let the market do its magic. What both of these views have in common is the premise that capitalism itself cannot be responsible for the chronic poverty, unemployment, insecurity, and hopelessness in which millions of people are stuck. Far from trapping people in conditions of insecurity and powerlessness, the market is a domain of freedom and opportunity. People choose what to do with their lives, how to develop their talents, and who to work for, or whether to work at all. All of these choices are freely made. Whatever obstacles there are in the way of people having a decent life are not in the system, since the system is nothing other than the sum total of the choices people have made, unconstrained. If they choose to work, they are rewarded for their initiative and talent. If they decide not to, well, then they suffer the consequences. So if some people get the short end of the stick, it is either due to their own deficiencies or because of external interference. It's easy to see that this is the view from the mansion. It is the ideology of the winners, those for whom the system works fantastically well. On this view, if someone is rich, it must be because of their hard work, not because they have the advantage of class. Their money reflects their skills and talents, not the power they wield over their workers. There is no oppression and no exploitation, only free choice and opportunity. For the last few decades, this explanation for people's misery didn't face much of a challenge. For what seems like a lifetime, it looked like people saw no choice but to hunker down and try to just get through, even if they had doubts about what their TVs and their teachers told them about how society works. The idolatry of the market seemed to drown out every other voice. But in the past few years, it's become pretty clear that people aren't buying the message anymore. Whereas it seems it was only yesterday that Margaret Thatcher proclaimed there was no alternative to the market fundamentalism that she espoused and implemented, that ideology is now in a shambles. Whereas politicians openly touted the virtues of a free market and open trade, this is no longer so. The debate is no longer on whether the market should be tamed, but how much it ought to be. Socialism, once taboo in public discourse, has exploded onto the political scene. According to an Axios Momentum poll, 41% of Americans had a positive view of socialism in 2021, and among the 18 to 24 age demographic, it was 51%. An alternative, to use Thatcher's language, is exactly what people seem to want. In 2015, the most frequently entered query in Google's search engine was socialism. Socialism is back in the air because there is a growing sense among working people that the problems they face aren't the doing of this or that party or politician, but stem from the way the system itself works. And in fact, this intuition on the part of billions of people is correct. The problem is the system, and if we're going to do anything to make the situation better, it is important to understand how that system works. It may be useful to summarize the 5 big points to take away from this chapter. Capitalism isn't just a collection of individuals, but individuals grouped in social classes. People don't come to the market as individuals competing on a level playing field. They are grouped into different classes and face very different economic conditions. The basic fact that differentiates the people into these classes is whether or not they own their means of production, land, factories, banks, hotels, etc. The vast majority of people don't. The only way they can survive is by working for those who do own the means of production, called capitalists. So most people in capitalism are simple workers, and they have no choice but to sell their labor effort to capitalists. Capitalists, in turn, sell the goods and services that they produce by hiring the workers. Both groups are forced to sell on the market, but what they sell is very different. And this means that they have different interests. Capitalists and workers have very different interests. Capitalists are driven to maximize profits, but in order to succeed, they typically have to wage constant war on their own employees. What every employer tries to achieve is to produce as cheaply as possible and to squeeze as much as he can out of his workers for every dollar he gives them. This naturally means that each employer tries to keep his employees' wages as low as he can, while also getting as much work out of them as he can in return. This runs against what workers desire. Whereas the employer wants to keep wages low, the worker wants to set them as high as he can. And while the employer wants to set the pace of work as high as he can, the worker wants to keep it at a reasonable level. But because the employer is the stronger party, workers have to accept the terms, even though it undermines their well-being. Capitalists aren't motivated by greed, but by market pressures. Capitalists don't cause harm to their employees out of malice or greed. Their motivation comes from the brute reality of market competition. If a capitalist doesn't produce at the lowest price, he knows that he will lose customers, and if that continues, his firm will start bleeding money. So he has to keep his selling price as low as possible. But if he's going to lower his selling price, he also has to lower his costs, or he won't make any money. Hence, he tries to pay out as little as possible for his inputs, the machines and raw material that he buys, and the wages he's paying to his workers. So every capitalist constantly tries to get the most out of every dollar he spends, including from his workers. This is how firms survive in the market. It has nothing to do with greed. This system creates enormous wealth, but also great misery for the majority. This is why, even though capitalism creates enormous wealth, its benefits are so lopsided. Workers would be better off if every time productivity went up, it would mean higher wages and shorter working days. But this doesn't happen in a free market. Even while productivity is increasing, employers respond by demanding more effort and longer hours. And just as importantly, even as profits go up, there is no guarantee that it'll come back to the employees in the form of higher wages. The employer will prefer to keep the increased profits himself, either to pay out to shareholders, or reinvest it, or put it in his pocket. This means that even as the economic pie expands, workers don't necessarily benefit from it. They can be stuck with stagnant wages, job insecurity, long hours, and ill health. If left to its own, the system itself creates enormous wealth for some and misery for the many. Workers only advance if they act collectively. The reason you get fantastic riches on one side and mass misery on the other is very simple. Workers are dependent on their employers, so they have to accept the terms they are offered. The boss gets to call the shots. Even though capitalists and workers both need the other, they aren't equals. Yes, a factory owner has to have workers, and workers need to find a job. It sounds like a good bargain for both. But in fact, the worker will always be more desperate than the employer. She typically has very little savings to tide her over, is living hand to mouth, and knows that if she doesn't agree to the wage being offered, there are lots of other equally desperate people who will take those terms. What makes her weaker is the fact that she is easily replaced if she turns down the offer. For workers, the only solution to this dilemma is to make it harder to be replaced if they choose to refuse their employer's offer, and the only way to consistently do this is by banding together. In other words, individual workers defend their interests by forming collective organizations. This is the lesson they have learned over the course of 2 centuries, and it is as true today as it was 2 centuries ago. With this summary as a guidepost for our basic argument, we can now work out the details. What is capitalism? Capitalism is a kind of economic system. It is a particular way of organizing the production of goods and services in a given population. Now, to suggest that capitalism is one way of organizing economic activity implies that it is not the only way of so doing. There have been other kinds of economic systems. 2 well-known examples are the slave economy of ancient Rome and feudalism in medieval Europe and Asia. So what sets capitalism apart? How do we know it when we see it? The simplest way to identify capitalism is on the basis of something called market dependence. In a capitalist society, the vast majority of people depend on the market to make a living. What this means is that when people try to acquire the basic necessities for their well-being, such as food, clothing, and shelter, they have to buy or rent them from someone else. They don't have the option of making the essentials themselves. A system in which everyone is market-dependent has several important characteristics. Production is carried out for selling on the market, not for self-consumption. What this means is that when producers make something, It is not for their own use. The main aim is the sale of that product to someone else. This has a profound effect on all aspects of production. Those people who organize and carry out economic decisions now have to focus single-mindedly on finding a buyer for their goods. It doesn't matter if the good or service is something they personally like or have a use for. All that matters is that someone else finds it desirable and wants to buy it. The labor that goes into production is by people working for a wage. Another way of saying this is that the typical form of employment in capitalism is wage labor. For most of human history, most people were self-employed. They worked on their own plots of land as peasants or in their own establishments as craftsmen. In capitalism, self-employment is the exception, not the rule. What is most common is for people to work for someone else. They work under their employer's direction for an agreed-upon amount of time and at an agreed-upon rate of compensation. The most common is an hourly rate, which is called a wage. Productive establishments are privately owned. What this means is that the places that hire wage laborers, like factories, warehouses, restaurants, and hotels, are owned by individuals who have full and exclusive authority over what to do with them. They also have authority over whom to hire, how many people to employ, what to produce, whether or not to expand production, and so on. These owners are called capitalists, and the assets that they own are called capital. These three elements are foundational to a capitalist system. It is important to note that while all three are important, it is really private ownership that gets the ball rolling. Wage labor has been present to some extent in many economic systems. It existed in ancient Rome and in every kind of medieval system in Europe and Asia. It also has been very common to have trade and exchange, and in fact, virtually every society with settled agriculture has had trade both within and outside its boundaries. But in all such cases, wage labor and trade were pretty minor phenomena. People worked for wages, but usually to supplement what they produced on their own land holdings. There might be some people who relied mainly on wage labor, but their number was always pretty small. Similarly, trade has been around for centuries, even millennia, but family units very rarely depended on exchange for their survival. What they took to the market was usually a surplus left over after their basic consumption needs had been satisfied. Hence, they didn't organize their production with the goal of selling on the market. What they made, therefore, remained geared toward personal consumption. So the mere fact that there exists some wage labor is not evidence for capitalism, nor is the existence of trade and exchange. Both these phenomena have existed within pre-capitalist economic systems. For them to be associated with capitalism, they have to move to being at the very center of economic activity. They have to become the organizing principles for production and distribution. So trade and wage labor become markers of capitalism when they become the anchors of the entire economy. That is, when they become the means by which production and consumption are carried out. And historically, this only happened once the vast majority of people lost their access to the means of production. Through most of human history, the vast bulk of the population lived on the land, and more importantly, individual families had publicly recognized rights to plots of land. As long as they had access to this land, they could produce for themselves. They grew their own crops, produced much of their own articles of consumption, and therefore did not have to rely either on selling on the market or working for a wage. They still participated in market transactions, and they even resorted to wage labor occasionally. But their survival never depended on these activities. They relied on them only to supplement their income and consumption. As long as they had access to the means of production, they could keep market forces at bay in their lives. But once economic actors are stripped of the means of production, once they lose access to land and capital, the conditions for their economic reproduction undergo a sea change. They can no longer rely on their own crops or handicrafts to survive, since they don't have access to key factors of production. They have to buy their articles of consumption on the market, which means that they have to first find a way of acquiring money in order to purchase them. This money comes from working for those few people who now have taken exclusive control over the means of production, the capitalists. Another way of putting all this is that capitalism comes about through the creation of a particular kind of class structure, in which there is a small group on one side called capitalists who control the basic means of production, and another group, the vast majority, on the other side, who don't have any choice but to seek employment from these capitalists. We call the second group the working class. It's the creation of this class system that brings about complete market dependence for everyone. The very act of creating a class of capitalists and a class of workers spreads the market throughout society. How does that happen? Here's how. By depriving the bulk of the population of the means of production, two new mass markets have been created simultaneously. First, by forcing the bulk of the population to go out looking for jobs, we have created a market for labor power. Owners of capital wishing to produce a good can now find labor on this newly established labor market. Second, by forcing these wage laborers to purchase their consumption goods on the market, we have created a mass market for those very goods, a market that didn't exist before, since people relied on their own means of production to feed and clothe themselves. There is now a market for labor, and another one for the goods that the labor will produce, whereas previously both of these were either very small or non-existent. Hence, what has kept wage labor and market exchange at the margins of economic production through most of human history is the absence of private property, and what enables them to take over the economy, to become the drivers of production and consumption decisions, is when one group of people manages to throw the bulk of the population off the land. It's all about profits. So now we know that in a capitalist economy, most people are distributed into two great classes. Production is controlled by capitalists, who employ workers to produce goods and services. These are sold on the market as commodities. It is from the sale of commodities that both workers and employers derive their income. This is worth examining at a little more length. Karl Marx gave a very intuitive description for the process through which a capitalist goes about their business. Suppose you're a capitalist with a sum of money that you want to use to start an enterprise. This sum of money is represented by the letter M. With this M, the capitalist then goes out and buys what they need to produce goods or services, land, machinery, raw materials, and, of course, labor power, produces the commodity, and takes it to the market to sell. The commodities produced are denoted by C. If C is successfully sold, the capitalist is able to recoup the money originally spent on inputs M. This completes the cycle of production. We can represent this as MCM. The M at the end of the production period represents the same sum of money that the employer started with, the original investment. If the employer manages to recoup this amount from sales revenue, they are in a position to start a new cycle of production and enter the market again to try their luck. If the original sum M is not recouped and revenues are less than the original value, there will be a drain on the employer's wealth. So at the very least, the capitalist needs to end up with the money he originally had, if he wants to stay in business. But while it is important for him to recoup his original investment, of course, this isn't all he needs. For one thing, he wouldn't have made any money for himself. For the capitalist to do that, there has to be an addition to the original value of M, a surplus over the money he pays out to others. We can represent this as delta M. The delta stands for the additional increment he has made over his initial investment, his profit. It is from this profit, the delta M, that he derives his own income, and also the money with which he can expand his operations, perhaps buy new machinery, etc. So the new M, the outputs M, need to be of a greater value than the original M, the input, if he wants to do more than just cover his costs. A more accurate way of representing the cycle is therefore as follows: MCM plus delta M. The additional increment is hardly a side note. It's actually the most important part of the production effort. The whole point of the cycle for the capitalist is to end up with a delta M. If not for that, his entire effort becomes a kind of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?